Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unchained, your no-hype resource for all things crypto. I'm your host, Laura Shin. Thanks for joining this live stream. Before we get started, a quick reminder, nothing you hear on Unchained is investment advice. This show is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and my guest and I may hold assets discussed on the show. For more disclosures, visit unchainedcrypto.com. Introducing Nexo, the premier digital wealth platform. Receive interest on your digital assets. Borrow against them without selling. Trade a variety of cryptocurrencies, all in one platform, now available in the US. Get started today at nexo.com/unchained. Today's topic is the future of agentic commerce. Here to discuss are Noah Levine, partner at A16Z, and Robbie Peterson, junior partner at Dragonfly. Welcome, Noah and Robbie.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, super excited to be here.
So the agentic commerce space has seen a number of new technical offerings in recent weeks, and both of you wrote pieces this week on what that future looks like. It was pretty interesting, actually, because your visions differ a bit. But Noah, why don't we start with you? Describe where you think this is all headed.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I think it's helpful to start by saying that we've seen this massive catalyst in new developers by virtue of, platforms like Claude Code. And as a result of that, I think what we're seeing is that there's this whole new demand for new services that these developers want to use. And so with the advent of new protocols like MPP and X402, what we're seeing is there's this new class of merchants, which I kind of titled headless merchants, which effectively the developer has no insight or has no idea who they necessarily are. But when they're going in and instructing their agent to go and purchase something, that agent is going out, discovering them, and then paying on a per transaction basis to effectively get those services. And I think that this is going to create a new wave of sort of B2B commerce where developers are looking for these new tools. And rather than them necessarily dictating who they are or going and finding them via website, they're going to be able to see them a more natural discovery through Claude Code itself.
And Robbie, what about you? Why don't you describe the vision that you laid out in your little essay on X?
Sure. Yeah, I would say broadly, I agree with Noah, maybe on the direction of travel. I would say maybe where we disagree is probably the magnitude of how big agentic commerce is, especially in the near term. I think my vision of how things kind of play out is agents kind of broadly fit into three categories. So one is commercial agents, and intuitively these are agents that are deployed kind of within businesses. Two, I would say you have kind of consumer agents. So these would be agents that sort of augment our personal lives or helping us buy kind of more consumer items. And then the last one I would say is these kind of bottom-up agents, and this is more consistent with kind of the OpenClaw phenomena. And these are agents that are actually autonomous and actually transacting in the real world. And I think 95% plus of kind of most agentic activity is ultimately going to be these commercial agents. And I think intuitively that's consistent with how if you look at like the SaaS market today, it's 95% plus of software is probably deployed within businesses, right, and governments. And I think the same thing will be true, for agents. And I think maybe the nuance that everyone seems to be missing is that, an agent fundamentally what it does is it automates. But that automation doesn't necessarily mean that it has to actually spend. And I think people have kind of conflated the two. And then just, sort of drawn the conclusion that agentic commerce should be massive. So I think that's on the sort of the commercial side. And then I think on the consumer side, I'm also very skeptical that agents are actually going to be transacting on behalf of, individuals autonomously. And I think, the common sort of, bull case for agentic commerce that people love to cite is, hey, I'm going to tell this agent, go book me a trip to Tokyo, let's say. And it's going to, it's going to find the hotels. It's going to scrape a bunch of sort of data. It's going to say, it's going to read reviews, look at photos. Maybe it'll have my calendar and all my preferences as well. And it'll ultimately say, okay, I booked this thing. You never had to kind of look up from what you were doing, and that's it. And I think that's kind of, that rests on a bunch of implicit assumptions. One of them being that, we will be willingly, we will actually want to outsource all of that to an agent. And I think the more realistic path is, hey, I'm going to ask this agent I'm going to tell it I want to go, book a trip to Tokyo. And then it's actually going to give me options. And then it's going to ask follow-up questions. And it may say, hey, where in Tokyo do you want to stay? And hey, here are some, reviews, and this is what they're saying about this hotel versus that hotel, and so on. And I think the other nuance people are missing is, preferences aren't a static thing. I think they're ultimately revealed in the process of discovery itself. And I think that's not just true for, whether it's booking a trip. I think that's also true for, whether you're buying groceries, and it's certainly true if you're buying clothes. You actually want to go see what the clothes look like and so on. So I think just most consumer decisions, the agent won't have the full context. And I think, again, I think there's all these qualitative inputs as well that you don't actually discover until you go through that process. And, an agent doing all that on your behalf never actually captured that kind of nuance that the consumer ultimately wants. So that would be on the consumer side. And then to Noah's point, I do think there is this emergent sort of category, and I would call these like bottom-up agents. And again, this was sort of catalyzed by, the open claw phenomena, to kind of Noah's point. I do think this category will grow. I think that said, it is still extremely nascent. And if you just look at the data, there aren't that many, people who are actually using these agents to transact. It's more, a lot of it's been sort of speculative, whether it's X402 or MTP. So I just think it's very early, and I think the market's just generally, or at least at a minimum, social sentiments got ahead of itself here.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when I was reading both of your pieces, I was thinking that this will probably roll out in stages. And so even though the visions that you laid out were a little bit different, like I didn't think either was kind of right or wrong, because I was like, well, they're probably both going to be right at different times. So maybe let's talk about just this moment right now where things are kind of getting built out, because like something that was interesting to me was that in both of your pieces, or just in various other things that you wrote, I saw that you both referenced how how credit cards will be fitting in with stablecoins. And, I think you both have ideas on like how much agents will use credit cards versus stablecoins. So yeah, can you talk about like how you think that will be decided, or like how, the trajectory of both of those types of payments will go in this early phase? And either one of you can go first.
Yeah, I can touch on that. No, I mean, I think, look, like if and I think it's very similar to the discourse that was happening a few years ago when people were talking about, well, stable coins are going to replace all of consumer to merchant payments. And, it turns out that the networks beyond, a lot of the additional value added services they provide, there is a huge, sort of Lindy effect where you have consumers that have been using cards for a very long time. You have merchants who've been accepting them for a very long time. And so I think, it was very natural that, for example, stablecoin linked cards ultimately became the preferred form for consumer to merchant payments. And I think a similar thing is kind of happening in agentic commerce, where, people are coming out and saying, well, look, there's all these benefits of using stablecoins versus cards. But, what they don't maybe realize is that for most, the average consumer, they're much more, familiar with using a card, and they would prefer to use one. And I also think there's been a lot of arguments that have said, agents can't hold cards and this technology doesn't work. But I think if you look under the hood, you can see things like, the same technology that powers Apple Pay with tokens is the exact same technology that the networks like Visa and MasterCard are using to power agentic commerce. And so I think from a starting point, it's going to take longer for the networks to, to establish their standards and to make cards conducive with this new form of commerce. But I think there's nothing from a technical standpoint that is going to stop cards from working. What I kind of talked about is, again, I think kind of to Robbie's point, like for a traditional consumer to merchant transaction, like if I'm looking to book a flight, people are going to have preferences. They're going to want to use cards to get things like points. There's an element of chargebacks and fraud, which is helpful. I think that is probably the more boring side of agentic commerce and is likely going to be won largely by the card networks. But that being said, I think, again, this whole new sort of developer ecosystem that's forming, what we're seeing is that there's all these new merchants that are being established that, are maybe a couple of buddies in their basement that are building a merchant in a couple of days via vibe coding. For those people, it's going to be somewhat, challenging for traditional acquirers and processors to underwrite them so that they can accept cards. And I think stablecoins are kind of emerging as this, new digital cash, similar to how, you'll have Macy's will accept cards, but you'll have street vendors on the, on the corner who are accepting cash. I think that for that group, stablecoins are actually a very useful solution.
And actually, just a quick question: who would be the equivalent of that in this world? That would be the equivalent of the street vendor accepting cash?
Yeah, so I mean, a great example is a couple of the report I did or the article I did before. I was looking at X402 volume, and there's this really great data provider, Allium, who has an X402 server. I didn't have an account in Allium, so I just wanted to get a couple of data points. I was able to, spend, I think it was 30 or 40 cents to build the entire report. No card, was very easy. I think for something like that, that's, data is a great use case for that.
And Robbie?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think Noah makes a bunch of great points there, and I thought his piece was actually the best piece that anyone's sort of written on, how things evolve, at least with respect to card networks versus blockchains. I think the reality is like today both are insufficient, and they're insufficient in their own ways. So if you look at card networks, what they've solved, which is actually very, very difficult to solve, and I don't think a lot of people fully understand this, is risk scoring and auth. So they're actually like authenticating each of these transactions, and it's not as simple as just saying, hey, this transaction's fine, let's let it through. It's, hey, we've like all these sophisticated data points that we're looking at, and then we're assigning some confidence interval to like, okay, could this be fraudulent, could it not be? So they've solved that. Where they're maybe a little more insufficient is on the settlement piece, right? Because settlement is not instant, and there's a bunch of structural reasons for that, which we can unpack, but that is where they're insufficient. Now conversely, if you look at blockchains, they have this instant settlement. Intuitively, this is a global, asset ledger that syncs in real time, which is very conducive for agentic transactions. What they have not solved, conversely, is, the actual risk scoring that the card networks have solved. So I think they're insufficient in their own ways, and I think they both have a lot of work to do. And I think each of them respectively will kind of continue to converge and build upon the same vision. I think the reason, at least with respect to these kind of bottom-up agents, as I would call them, and as Noah alluded to, this could be, a bunch of, people just hacky devs kind of spinning up, different agents kind of, in their garage or whatever. I think with respect to those use cases, I think blockchains win for a different reason and a non-technical reason, which is they're open and they're permissionless and they're unencumbered by sort of any regulation, right? And maybe said differently, there's just way less friction building on blockchains versus building on traditional, Rails. And Visa and MasterCard, these are public companies that have shareholders, that have institutional counterparties, and they will inherently not be able to take the same amount of risk that like a blockchain could, because blockchain doesn't have shareholders, they don't have this risk. So I think for that reason, most of this experimentation probably actually does happen on chain, but maybe that's not for the reason that most people are thinking intuitively.
Okay. So one thing that I did want to ask about was, for like the way that this goes with, what you call the bottom up agents, and then I don't remember what you call the other ones, but I was just curious, like, for the bottom up agents, they would still need to have some back and forth with like their human, right? Or like, how is it that they are more autonomous?
Yeah, so the way I would frame this is, if you're looking at kind of the other side is commercial agents and then kind of consumer agents. And the reason I would say these are more top down is because I think they will ultimately, be distributed, and they're going to be distributed via, some software vendor, probably, at least on the commercial side. And then on the consumer side, maybe it's, OpenAI, distributing this via, ChatGPT or Anthropic, through Claude. But there will be some human in the loop in both of those contexts, right? Whereas I think with respect to these bottom-up agents, they actually are, agentic. Like I think semantically, you can actually use, the word agentic in that context, right? And they will be fully autonomous, and they will be procuring kind of their own resources and, calling these APIs and so on. And there won't be a human necessarily in the loop.
Like what I'm confused about is who will create them? How do they create them? It almost sounds like you're saying they create themselves, but I don't understand that.
No, I think like they'll still be created, by a human, and they'll still, fundamentally be serving, on behalf of a human. Maybe at some point you have agents spinning up other agents and so on, right? So yes, there will be human in the loop insofar as they will be serving a human, but the guardrails will be much wider. And I think that's kind of the nuances is, on these commercial and consumer agents, the guardrails are very narrow. And if anything, they aren't even, transacting. It's more, hey, I'm a research assistant that's going to help you figure out what hotel to book, but I'm not actually going to book the hotel. Like at the end of the day, it's going to be you that actually authorizes that transaction. And maybe you already have your card details, plugged in. So it's just like an Apple Pay transaction, right? And again, on the commercial side, I don't, it's a Salesforce agent, right? Which is going out and doing automated, sales outreach. That does not necessitate the agent actually transacting, right? And then similarly, maybe it's a, finance agent that's, automating finance functions. So none of that necessitates an agent actually transacting. Whereas conversely, I think with the bottom up agents, they actually are autonomous and they're actually going out and doing things. And maybe they're interfacing not just with these APIs and procuring resources from humans, but they're probably also could be interfacing with other agents. And I think that's a qualitatively different category.
Yeah, I forget which one of you said this, but I guess that example of the data that you're procuring for like a really small amount of money would probably be a good example of that. So one other thing that I think it might have been both of your pieces or even in this conversation that you both referenced was um, a lot of times payments actually cannot be instantaneous because of the possibility of fraud. So how do you think that gets factored into agentic commerce and how this is all built out?
Yeah.
No, do you want
Well,
to
I
take
mean,
this?
yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I think, again, if you take back to an example like booking a flight, I think, again, if you go through traditional card networks and you go through the traditional rails, I think you get the same benefit, fraud and chargeback benefits that you get, with traditional e-commerce. I think again, going back to kind of my thinking of there will be a whole new class of merchants that are going to get paid on a, per transaction basis. If I'm buying a service for fractions of a cent or a few cents, this notion of fraud, I think, is a lot less relevant because frankly, if I use a service and maybe it's a scam or it doesn't work, it's frustrating for a little bit of time, but ultimately I can be okay with, wasting a few cents and, can say, look, don't use this service again. I think where this gets problematic is when I'm going and purchasing, high value or high ticket item purchases. And at that point, I think that's where, for example, the card networks are going to continue to have an advantage. But I think if you believe that a lot of these, it's not going to be these enterprise agreements and major SaaS agreements. And again, it's just, I have a specific project that I'm building and maybe I want to use this tool once. I don't think fraud is as big of an issue because at the end of the day, it's not a big enough amount of money that I'm spending where it materially impacts me.
All right. So, in a moment, we're going to talk a little bit more about the different types of agents that will exist and how this will play out. But first, a quick word from the sponsors who make this show possible. Step into a new era of wealth. Discover Nexo, the premier digital wealth platform. Manage your crypto portfolio with confidence and control. Receive interest on your digital assets. Borrow against them without selling. Trade a wide range of cryptocurrencies, all in one platform. Now available in the US with 30 days of exclusive privileges for new clients. Experience Wealth Club Premier. Access enhanced interest rates, reduced borrowing costs, and crypto cashback on swaps. Get started today at nexo.com/unchained. Back to my conversation with Noah and Robbie. So Noah, I actually wanted to ask you what you thought about Robbie's taxonomy of the different types of agents and how you think that part might play out in terms of ones that transact more than others.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, like today, it kind of feels like there's a lot of conversation about having all these different agents doing these different things. But, frankly, at least from my perspective, it feels like they're all sort of part of the exact same ecosystem. Like, for example, you can spin up different sub agents within that can focus on different tasks. But at the end of the day, it kind of feels like it rolls up to the same product or to the same agent. And so I think what we're going to see is that, and we're starting to see this develop already with sort of this new skills ecosystem that, there are certain sort of almost like character builds that you can have where a certain agent has infinite amount of intelligence, but when you give it very specific guardrails or very specific, kind of constraints, it will be more useful for that task. I think how that impacts commerce though is kind of immaterial because to Robbie's point, if the human or the developer is ultimately the one that's making the payment, it really only matters, if you have one balance. And so I think one of the areas where a lot of the commentary, in my opinion, has gotten a little bit sideways is there's this notion that like, I'm going to have 10,000 different sub agents and each one's going to need their own wallet and each one's going to have their own controls and all these things. And I think, frankly, a lot of that is a little bit overcomplicated. And I probably tend to gear more towards Robbie's opinion there, where at the end of the day, like, if a given task has a certain mandate of how much you're willing to spend, how much each agent or participant spends is kind of irrelevant. And so I think from that respect, we're likely to see more subdivision between different subagents of what they do. But I think from a commerce perspective, it won't be as complicated.
All right. So to go back to the fraud issue, I wondered what other roadblocks you see that need to be solved in order for the agentic commerce space to be built out and grow?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have talked about, the Rails being kind of the ultimate bottleneck. And, the thought experiment is like, hey, if we can, solve the Rails and have instant payments and micropayments, then, the agentic commerce will, it'll completely take off. I think my perspective is it is not the Rails that's the bottleneck, and it's actually human sort of social structures. And I think I don't know that people are willingly going to just outsource everything to an agent. I think that implicitly takes a lot of trust. And that's not consistent with how decisions have historically been made for consumers. So that would be one example. I think more consequential examples are bureaucratic inertia, right? I think if you believe that a lot of these agents are going to be these commercial agents that are ultimately going to be deployed sort of top down within organizations, there are multiple layers you have to ultimately get through to actually be able to sell that within an organization. And I do think it'll be a competitive necessity down the road, and it'll be almost like a liability if you don't integrate these agents. But I think that actually takes a lot longer than people intuitively think. The other thing is government spending is, a massive part of the economy. And I think you'd be crazy to think that, governments are going to be adopting agents within the next few years. I think that's also going to take a very long time. And there's plenty of precedents throughout history that would also be consistent with that. The other thing is legal and regulatory bottlenecks as well. And I think that's another thing, there isn't enough people kind of discussing that, where, it's not just, the Rails that weren't engineered for machines. It's also, our entire regulatory system, our entire legal structure. And I don't think it's going to be something, in the same way that a protocol upgrade is sufficient to fix kind of the Rails. There's no protocol upgrade that can be applied to legal structures, right? There's a lot more, again, just inertia there. So I think that's what everyone's sort of underestimating is there are so many bottlenecks to adoption. I think the technology will be there, and you could almost argue it's already there. But that doesn't necessarily mean, everything's going to be adopted overnight.
Noah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I personally am more bullish on how much comfortability humans will get with agents taking off. I mean, I think if you go back to the early internet days, or there was similar fears. I think of is my data going to get taken? How secure, how safe is this? And over time, I think people got more comfortable with it, and the technology and the guardrails improved. And I think people are going to optimize for what is the lowest barrier to entry, and how to create the most efficiency in their lives, even if it means taking a little bit of a risk. I mean, even if you look at the OpenClaw ecosystem, there's a lot of setups of OpenClaw that I think are less than ideal or not very safe, but people still do it because they like experimenting. And I think over time, as the guardrails get there, that's how you start to cross the chasm and you get more mainstream adoption. I think for me, if I was to say what is the biggest barrier, at least especially in this sort of new headless merchant in agentic economy that I kind of talked about, I think it's honestly less about the Rails. I agree with Robbie there, and I think it's more on the discoverability layer. If you have thousands and thousands of new potential endpoints that you could be hitting, and they all kind of look like perfect complements to one another, how do you differentiate between them? And so, I think it's an open question of is this something that gets developed from a private company, or versus is this a sort of an open ecosystem? I think we see that debate happen a lot in crypto itself as well, with this topic and outside of it. But I think, in order for this to be useful, there needs to be more signal in terms of actually how safe is this? How reliable is this? And I think that will grow the network significantly.
Yeah, so on that score, I actually did want to ask about some of the different standards that are out there, because so Noah mentioned this marketplace in his piece, and that is powered by MPP. The I'm just it's Merchant Payments Protocol by Stripe and Tempo. Another big name that people are talking about is Coinbase's X402, or they developed it. It's like an open standard. I think the short version of the difference between these two is MPP has something called sessions, which is sort of like opening a tab at a bar with a budget. Frankly, also to me, it sounded just so super similar to lightning channels or state channels. And, then but the one other detail about MPP is basically at this moment, it's more centralized. It's only settling on Tempo. It requires Stripe, but it does connect to traditional payment rails like Visa. And they say that, they will eventually be chain agnostic. And at the moment, they also have Lightspark on it, which is a Lightning payments company with Bitcoin. X402 is just more permissionless. It supports any ERC20 token at the moment. It's gasless for users, but it doesn't have the sessions aspect. So you're, transacting with every request. And I just wondered if you had thoughts on like different type of architectures and which ones you think will be adopted more quickly, and why you thought that. And you can name any others because there's a whole bunch of others like, Visa's CLI tool, the Google Agent Payments Protocol, AP2. There's a bunch. So you can, talk about anyone's.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I mean, look, I think I'm pretty optimistic on both X402 and on MPP. I think obviously the benefit that MPP has is that they obviously have the Stripe ecosystem behind them. So I think there's definitely a head start there where if you have existing Stripe merchants who want to participate in this new agentic economy, it'll potentially be a lot easier for them to just click a button and have that enabled versus, maybe with X402, you got to go and set up a facilitator and, potentially will require more bespoke integrations. And, it's worth noting that Stripe also integrated X402 prior to the announcement of MPP. So I think it's still it's unclear how this will develop. I think obviously the crypto ecosystem tends to prefer more of the open permissionless standards, but I also think that there are some benefits you have when you can control the product more. And, I think to your example of things like sessions and also the ability to use traditional payment methods is a huge step in the right direction. I do think it's worth, Visa CLI is a new product that Visa is developing where it's not a protocol, but rather it's sort of a new CLI based wallet. And so, you similar to, I think some of the other wallets that we're seeing, you can, download it into OpenClaw or Claude Code. You can go and transact at a bunch of different endpoints. It comes with a whole directory of endpoints, I think, that they've developed, as well as connection to existing ones. And unlike, I think some of the other MPC-based wallets, like it comes, default with card. And so, again, I think at this point, as I mentioned in my paper, I feel like the rails are largely there. And, who wins is probably less relevant because it's ultimately going to come down to what merchants want to integrate with. I think the bigger question is who are the new merchants that are going to come out and, what services are they going to create that is useful to developers to the point that they want to adopt this? I think that to me is the bigger question and the bigger opportunity for innovation.
But do you want to elaborate on that? Like what type of merchants you think will come out for,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's one area that is less talked about is there's a lot of interesting stuff on the creative side. So, the ability to vibe code music, the ability to, have image generation. I think we've seen a lot of creative things there. And so, the ability to generate a song with, explaining the vibe and the mood is interesting. But I think it's going to expand much more into more general developer services. I think if you've used, any of these coding platforms, you notice that there's a lot of commerce moments that happen when you're using it. Whether you need to get a domain name, whether you need to set up a server, whether you need to get access to proprietary data. I think there's all these commerce moments where you have to leave the terminal, go and get an API key, maybe get a subscription, then come back into Claude Code or OpenClaw and paste it in, and it's a big friction point. And so I think the more that people develop on the kind of the buyer side, it will lead to more inspiration and influence on the seller side.
And Robbie, what about you? What thoughts do you have about which types of platforms will do well in this world?
Yeah, I think part of the irony at this point, at least, is a lot of them are backwards compatible with cards. And I think, Noah's made this point. I think this is probably an area we actually do agree on is, there is this inertia, again, where, people are used to making kind of payments with cards. And again, I think one of the really important things is these card networks do have, all these tokenized credentials, right? So they have solved for this kind of fraud and risk scoring issue that blockchains just haven't solved for. And I think it'll take a really long time. I think one nuance that I've been thinking about more is, do these tokenized credentials and these kind of, fraud graphs that the card networks have made and, have refined over years and years, do they actually map well to agentic commerce, right? So if an agent is making a transaction, obviously that's fundamentally different to a human, and the behavioral sort of patterns will also look, quite different. So I'm also, curious that, if we end up seeing, almost like new fraud graphs and new risk scoring, have to evolve for agents. And I actually think Noah sort of alluded to this in one of his pieces where, maybe that is the opportunity for blockchains, right? It kind of creates this gap where because no one has solved for it, then maybe that's something, blockchains could actually solve for. And that's kind of the wedge that they need to ultimately compete with card networks on the agentic side.
Oh my gosh, that is so interesting. That makes a lot of sense to me because I mean, I just, as you know, there's so much crime in crypto. So I feel like through crypto, I've learned a lot about kind of the behavior of criminals. And I remember, when Katie Haun was a prosecutor and she figured out that there were two separate federal agents that were stealing the Bitcoin that were, what's the word, seized from Silk Road. The way she figured it out was that somebody tipped her off. They thought an agent was doing this. And then she thought, no, they wouldn't be. And she wanted to prove this person wrong. But then when she looked at the behaviors, she was like, oh, it's not just that somebody's doing it, but there's two people because their behaviors are so different. It was so obvious that they were two different people. So, yeah, like with an agent, you wouldn't have that kind of, I mean, you might, but it would just be harder to figure out like what are the idiosyncratic kind of behaviors that mark a person. I did also want to ask about a thought that I had, which was I think something that is a little bit more permissioned, like the MPP protocol will maybe succeed first, especially because they already do have so many merchants. But that like maybe over time, X402 or just anything that's more permissionless might do better. And I know that MPP is heading in that direction, so it may not be that they fall behind at that point. But it just sort of feels like there could be an analog to the early internet where AOL was how everybody got online first, and then of course like nobody uses AOL anymore. So it feels like there is something like that. Like you have this sort of handholdy kind of setup to begin with, and then it moves beyond. So I did also want to ask, like I imagine that the rise of AI agents and as you're looking at the future of agentic commerce, that it's changing a lot about how you think about just VC generally. Like I know for me, even just as an entrepreneur, it's changing how I think about like what types of businesses would be viable in this new world. So I was just wondering, how is all of this affecting either how venture capital, like what types of projects you're looking to fund, or what types of projects you're even being pitched?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first and let Noah comment as well. But I do think a lot of it distills down to sort of value capture and where you ultimately think value accrues sort of within the stack. And I think something that a lot of people have been saying is, what these agents do fundamentally is they abstract away the entire front end interface. And instead of, trading, whether it's, crypto and you're trading or, you're, depositing some funds into, these yield protocols. Well, what you're actually going to do is you're going to tell this agent, go do all this for me. And then you don't need those, you don't need the chart, right? You don't need any of the kind of interface on the front end. I actually fundamentally disagree with that take. And I actually think, especially on the trading side, and I wrote a piece a while ago, maybe 2 years ago, called the Fat Wallet Thesis. And the sort of core thesis there is that whoever owns the end user ultimately captures the most value. And I think that's been consistent, across literally, every emerging vertical probably throughout history. And I think it's especially true sort of in the internet era. And I think, a lot of people are saying that, agentic, all these agent interfaces are going to undermine kind of this fat wallet thesis and so on. And I think the reason it won't is because people actually like interfaces. And I think, again, this is another nuance that the entire sort of agentic thesis misses, which is, if I'm trading, for example, in crypto, the chart itself governs my decision of whether I want to go long or short or, or buy or sell or whatever. And I think like that is not something that users will want abstracted away ever. And I think that's actually something they're gonna always want to keep. And maybe it's, hey, I will have the agent, find me the best yield source, right? Like I think that's one example where maybe it is sort of interesting, right? I have some USDC sitting in my wallet and I say, hey, just go find me the best, risk adjusted yields. And it goes and on the back end, kind of deposits that. But I think especially on the trading side, and obviously that's sort of been the principal, consumer use case for crypto is, people just want to trade, crypto. So I think that agents don't really, disrupt that. And then the other thing I would add is, in terms of, okay, how does value accrue then? So maybe some of this accrues to the front end, and whoever owns the end user. I think you also want to own kind of the settlement layer as well. And I think it's kind of this barbell of where value accrues. And on the settlement layer, intuitively, there's more of a network effect there, where like the more volume that settles, the more volume that settles, right? And sort of volume and liquidity begets volume and liquidity and so on. And I think that's where, and I don't know who's going to win. And, I think at this point, I think Tempo is probably, maybe the front runner for at least all the agentic stuff, given they kind of have the right partners, who are in the mix, and they have kind of the merchant distribution of Stripe and so on. So, but I think ultimately, with respect to VC and how I think about value capture, I think it's, you want to be on one side of kind of that barbell.
And actually, just one question. When you said, I forget how you phrased it. Did you say, oh, you want to like own the platform, like where people or agents are congregating? But so right now we are seeing like websites pop up, but I don't imagine the agents will like congregate at websites, or so am I?
Yeah. I was more referring in the crypto context of, sort of wallets and trading and sort of the use cases that people are, using within crypto. And I think that's where you want to own whoever, has owns kind of the end user. I think like, if you're then to extrapolate that out and say, you look at all agentic use cases, I think that probably looks more like the chatbot interface, right? So whether that's, ChatGPT or Claude, I think that's the other layer that you want to own, because again, they own kind of the end user. And I think downstream of that, there's a lot of different ways to monetize.
Mm-hmm.
Noah?
Yeah, no. Well, first of all, the fat wallet piece, that was a great piece. Highly recommend anyone to read it. It was great. But the one area that I will kind of push back is I tend to fully agree with you that like whoever is owning the end customer will ultimately accrue a lot of the value. But I think what's so interesting about AI, and there's actually this really, I think, interesting crossover where, what we're seeing is that the front end and the back end are becoming increasingly separated. And the parallel is, I think I had this, one of the big eye-opening moments for me in crypto, I think, was when I first used a self-custodial wallet, and I actually exported my keys and then imported the keys into another wallet. And you see that the interface changes, but the back end is the same. And so I think there's a very interesting thing happening in AI where the back end is static, but the front end is becoming increasingly more modular. And so, for example, like, while I agree with you that people do have preferences over what the front end is and how they engage with it, what I think we're seeing with these tools is that it's actually much easier to create your own front end. And so, for example, if you really like a certain trading app, right, but maybe you don't like one or two features, what you could do is, as long as you have the back end in and the back end's in place, then you can very easily customize what that front end looks like. And so I think from that regard, whatever the hardest thing to do is, or whatever the biggest sticking point is in the back end and the infrastructure, where there's some sort of mode and some sort of capability that they uniquely have, I think that ends up being very valuable, because ultimately what AI is largely going to do is it's going to make it such that you can build any front end that you want, and you can customize it to a much greater degree.
All right. Well, this has been super fun chatting with you both. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and coming on Unchained.
Awesome. Thanks for having us, Laura.
Thank you.
We will catch you later.